Hey guys, welcome to BP, the Bible Perspective. What's really behind the criticism of critical race theory? I say it's race. Now before we get into it, please like and share this video and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comments section below. All comments are welcome. Now, I've been seeing a whole lot of feedback, pushback on what is called critical race theory. And often when I hear these kinds of feedback, it kind of piques my interest, of course, because what's behind this surge? So it depends on, of course, from a Christian perspective, and this is what I'm mostly interested in. I understand the secular pushback and arguments and pros and cons. But why the Christian? Now, there's a lot of Christians pushing back on critical race theory. Is race the issue? And I say race is definitely the issue. Now, before we understand it, we have to understand what is critical race theory. And I'm just sharing a few thoughts here, but I'm not going to get into it. This is actually a prelude to a much in-depth study, which I will get into. I'm putting it together now. I want to really go into this. I just want to introduce where I'm going to go with this. Critical race theory is an academic, okay, that was kind of developed in the early 70s. One of the principals was Professor Derek Bell. The academic itself was a legal one that looked at how the law intersects with race and racism. Now that's important because remember, this was developed during the 70s. Well, we fast forward to the day. What is it that people are responding to with critical race theory? Well, they're responding because now it's gained traction. When we think about certain political movements that has its kind of DNA as race, it's in other words, they're race driven. I'll give you some examples. Black Lives Matter, BLM, right? The 1619 Project. Why are people so now pushing against these kind of movements? Let me be clear. I am not defending the movements themselves. There are both good and bad points to be talked about and explored with them. What I'm talking about is why are people so upset about them? And what is the nature of the pushback? And especially Christians who are pushing back. Now, you see churches now pushing back. You see people now saying, hey, critical race theory. And there is a motive by that. I'm saying a lot of black conservative in the Christian movement push back on critical race theory. And definitely there's a motive. And it is a race motive. You see, the problem is that are they pushing back this ideology here? This is a present day ideology that is being driven. White supremacy groups has skyrocketed over 800%. This trend began under the Obama administration and certainly found its life thriving under Trump. Remember Trump said when he was questioned in the campaign, would you tell white supremacy people to stop? And basically he said, stand back and stand by. That's what Trump said. And they did just that. And then, of course, we had January 6th, right? Where these Trump devotees, under the notion that they were going to reverse the election, stormed. And what did you see? You saw Trump flags, Confederate flags, Nazi flags, and white supremacist flags, okay? And Christian flags. But the main point of pushing back on critical race theory is the idea that now it is in school. Now, the reason why I put this picture up here, if you notice, This was in the 50s. All of these areas here, those pictures, were in the 50s and the 60s. Notice the church. Notice the government. Notice the schools. Right? That was then. Oh, by the way, they're not talking about critical race theory there in terms of that kind of race mixing. See, the problem I have with the criticism of Christians who are criticizing critical race theory is you have no problem with that. You're not exploring that. See, my question is, how did we get to Black Lives Matter? You know, there's a lot of pushback on Black Lives Matter. And again, they deserve some criticism. The 1619 Project deserves some criticism. But why are people mostly upset over it? And it's not because she's talking about the slaves landing in 1619. They don't even mention that. Same thing with critical race theory. How do we get to this point of critical race theory? Well, one reason is because racial issues are gaining momentum. When last year, the hideous murder of George Floyd, the world took note of Black Lives Matter. That's upsetting people. Now there is a forward momentum to push to get some of these ideologies taught in schools. And right there is where you see some of the biggest pushback. The point is that in criticizing critical race theory, you have people that's not even talking about race. How can you criticize without talking about race? Why? Because it's not about that to them. See, just like this here, they didn't want they didn't want black people integrated into their system. The bottom was right there. That's a school setting. When you look at that bottom picture of the black girl, she was being escorted. She was trying to get into school. Now, let me show you another picture. That is right there, the Texas Senate just last year voting how to teach racism in schools. Critical race theory opponents do not talk about that, since they're talking about, remember, the school issue. Remember, they're talking about race issues being taught and how they're being taught. But they're not talking about that. That headline, this one here, is when the Texas Senate voted, this is how we're going to teach about slavery. That is no big deal, right? They limited how race was going to be taught, how slavery was going to be taught. You see, the problem with people who say, we don't like critical race theory, certainly don't mind the perversion taught about slavery. 4 years ago, well now 5 years ago, when Virginia, the state of Virginia was celebrating its celebration, conveniently didn't even want to mention the slavery part. Now think about that. So again, I'm going to come back to why are people so upset over critical race theory? Because white people are mad about it. They're not mad about this. They're mad about the fact that certain aspects of their reality is now being thrown back in their face. Hence Christians now. Same thing with Christians. You have Christians who are now pushing back on critical race theory. For example, the Southern Baptists pushing back on critical race theory. I'm sorry. The Southern Baptist was founded on the very DNA of racism. Oh yes, and now they're rejecting critical race theory. So how can you have a discussion about critical race theory without talking about how we got to critical race theory? And by the way, in all of the arguments, mostly, I never hear them really talk about, are the points of critical race theory true? In other words, if you say that they're not true, they basically just say critical race theory, bad, evil. But they never say, is it true? Were we a racist country? Were we a racist nation? Don't misunderstand me. Remember, these are academics. And by nature, academics start from a humanist point of view, which means they are very objectionable to God's word. But then Christians or God's people come along and jump on the same boat. And that's the problem. Look, as I said, I'm going to do a more in-depth dive into this issue of critical race theory and why both sides are wrong, but mostly why Christians are wrong, because they never deal with the real truth of it, that they're cuddling to, should I say white fragility? I'm not saying that. I'm just playing around with that. But I will say this, that those who are opposing, especially black conservatives, those who are opposing critical race theories, certainly are doing that. In other words, you don't want to deal with the truth, see, of how we got there. And that's the most important thing that is overlooked in all of this opposition to critical race theory. Look, that is my perspective. Don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comment section below. Look, the next time, I'll see you then.